Welcome to my channel.
The wind off the Atlantic did not merely blow into the village of Lochdubh. It performed a mournful, high-pitched shriek through the eaves of the police station, carrying with it the scent of salt, wet heather, and the promise of a winter that was intended to be difficult. Inside, PC Hamish Macbeth sat by the warmth of his peat stove, his long, lanky frame folded into a chair that was held together more by habit than joinery. His red hair was a chaotic thicket, and his hazel eyes were fixed with deceptive vacancy on a blue-rimmed pot of coffee that was currently the most important object in his universe. He was currently engaged in his favourite pastime, the art of appearing entirely useless. If he sat still enough, perhaps the Highland mist would swallow the station whole, rendering him invisible to the demands of the Northern Constabulary and, more importantly, to the sharp, abrasive tongue of Detective Chief Inspector Blair in Strathbane. Beside him, Lugs, a dog of indeterminate breed and remarkable ugliness, let out a soft, snoring huff. "I know, Lugs," Hamish murmured, pouring a steaming cup. "It's a day for peace, a bit of poaching, and staying well away from anyone who uses the word efficiency without a sneer." His peace was shattered by the arrival of a vehicle that sounded like a low-flying jet. A sleek silver Jaguar, a car entirely too expensive and low-slung for the rutted Highland roads, screeched to a halt outside. Out stepped a woman who looked as though she had been curated by an expensive London boutique specifically to annoy the locals. This was Penelope Vane, a lifestyle influencer and former knitwear designer who had recently purchased a sprawling cottage on the edge of the loch. Penelope was a Sassenach of the most irritating variety, wealthy, patronizing, and possessed by the delusion that the Highlands were a quaint stage set for her slow-living brand. Penelope burst into the station without knocking, bringing a gust of freezing air and an aroma of expensive lavender that clashed violently with the smell of Hamish's wood smoke. "Macbeth, are you awake, or is this the permanent state of the local constabulary?" she barked, her voice a sharp, modulated trill. "I am hosting the Lochdubh artisanal knitting retreat this weekend. Very influential people are coming from the city, and yet this morning I found my driveway blocked by a delivery of manure that I most certainly did not order. It's some primal Gaelic bullying, isn't it? I want it cleared. I want the culprit found and shamed on social media. I pay a staggering amount of council tax, and I expect the law to be more than a tall man in a dirty jumper staring at a kettle." Hamish looked at her with a slow, bovine blink, his face a mask of rustic bewilderment. "Manure, you say? It'll likely be a mistake by young Geordie at the farm, ma'am. He's a bit distracted since his cow took ill. I'm sure it'll dry up and blow away soon enough." "Don't give me that Highland mystical rubbish," Penelope snapped, her eyes narrowing. "I have a house full of hand-spun mohair and international guests arriving in 3 hours. If I see one more speck of agricultural waste or find the locals snickering at me behind the post office counter, I'll be speaking to the chief constable. I know people in Edinburgh, Macbeth. People who don't care for lazy village bobbies." "Oh, I'm sure you do, ma'am," Hamish drawled, his voice a soft rhythmic burr. "I'll have a word with the wind. Tell it to blow the smell toward the sea." After Penelope stormed out, her Jaguar throwing up a spray of slush as she roared away. Hamish sighed and reached for a second cup of coffee. He had a premonition, a dark, cold feeling that sat in his stomach like an undigested scone. Penelope Vane was a woman who didn't just rub people the wrong way, she seemed to delight in it. She had already managed to offend the local spinning circle by calling their traditional methods unrefined and had filed a noise complaint against the church bells. In Lochdubh, when an outsider like Penelope started shouting about artisanal retreats and influential friends, the universe usually responded with something much messier than a pile of manure. He didn't know it yet, but the peace of Lochdubh was already beginning to unspool. Penelope's arrogance had stirred a quiet, vengeful fire in the village, and by tomorrow the artisanal knitting retreat would be famous for a pattern that involved far more than wool and needles. The following morning the Scottish mist didn't so much descend as it did colonize the glen, a thick white blanket that muffled the world and turned the mountains into looming grey spectres. Hamish had just finished his first cup of coffee and was considering the merits of a second when the peace of the station was shattered by a sound far more distressing than Penelope Vane's silver jaguar. It was the frantic, high-pitched wail of the station telephone. He let it ring 4 times, hoping it might be a wrong number or a particularly persistent salesman, before finally lifting the receiver with a heavy, reluctant sigh that suggested he was being asked to move a mountain rather than answer a call. He adjusted his lanky frame in the creaking chair, his hazel eyes fixed on a cobweb in the corner of the ceiling. "Lochdubh police," he murmured, his voice thick with a feigned early-morning grogginess that he used as a defensive shield against the outside world. "Macbeth, get your lazy carcass up to the Vane cottage this instant." It was the voice of Mrs. Kennedy, the village's most prolific source of news, and she sounded as though she had just seen the Loch Ness monster in her laundry basket. "It's that London woman, Penelope. I went up to deliver the extra eggs she demanded for her fancy retreat. Organic and blue-shelled, if you please. And I found the front door wide open. When I walked into the lounge, I saw, oh, Hamish, it's ghastly. She's sitting there in her designer chair, but she's not exactly knitting anymore." Hamish felt the familiar, cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He whistled for Lugs, who was busy investigating a rogue biscuit crumb near the stove, and pulled on his heavy, salt-stained greatcoat. The drive up to the Vane cottage was a slow crawl through visibility-choking fog, the Land Rover's headlights reflecting uselessly off the swirling white wall of the Highland winter. When he finally reached the gravel driveway, the pile of manure Penelope had complained about was still there, a steaming, dark monument to local displeasure that sat right in the centre of her meticulously raked path. He found the scene in the sunroom, a glass-walled space that overlooked the loch. Though today it saw nothing but white, Penelope Vane was indeed in her chair, a mid-century modern piece that looked entirely too uncomfortable for a Highland winter. She was slumped forward, her head resting against a low table. But it wasn't the posture that caught Hamish's eye. It was the fact that she was entangled in her own brand of success. An enormous, oversized knitting basket had been overturned, and Penelope was literally bound to the chair by several hundred yards of hand-dyed neon-pink mohair. The wool was looped around her throat and chest in a chaotic, tangled web, and a pair of long, sharp rosewood knitting needles were protruding from the side of her neck, like the antennae of a strange luxury insect. "A bit of a messy stitch, wouldn't you say, Lugs?" Hamish whispered, his breath a plume of white in the frozen air. The dog let out a low, mournful whine and sat back on his haunches, his mismatched ears twitching with unease at the smell of expensive lavender mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Hamish knelt by the body, his eyes taking in every detail with a sharp precision he would never admit to. On the table, right next to Penelope's cold hand, lay a single damp sprig of white heather. It was the same Highland calling card that usually signalled a very specific type of local grudge. There was no sign of a forced entry, and Penelope's diamond rings were still on her fingers, ruling out a simple robbery. In her lap sat a half-finished scarf, the pattern intricate and perfect, except for the final, jagged row where the needles had been violently yanked away. The silence of the cottage was suddenly violated by the aggressive, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter. Hamish winced, his heart sinking. It was the Strathbane response team, and they were early. Within minutes, the fog was whipped into a frenzy by the rotors, and a black sedan skidded to a halt on the lawn, spraying gravel over Penelope's imported ornamental grasses. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, his face already a dangerous shade of crimson, followed by his shadow, Detective Anderson. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the cottage walls like a gunshot. "I might have known I'd find you here, standing around while a taxpayer is turned into a macrame project. What have you done to the scene? Have you been looking for a free sweater, or did you just want to see if the wool was soft enough for your own knitting?" "I've touched nothing, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into its most rhythmic, deceptive lilt. "I only just arrived. It's EMS Mrs. Vane had a bit of a final disagreement with her hobby." Blair marched to the body, his eyes bulging at the pink mohair. "An accident? The woman has been skewered by a toothpick. This is a clear case of Highland savagery, Macbeth." Some disgruntled local decided to make a point about her artisanal attitude. He turned to Anderson, his finger stabbing the air. I want a list of every weaver and spinner in this village. We're going to find out who had the strength to pull this off, and we're going to start with whoever delivered that manure." Hamish watched Blair stomp around the room, oblivious to the fact that he was currently crushing a very specific set of narrow footprints near the door. Blair was looking for a brute, but Hamish was looking at the white heather. He knew that in Lochdubh, the deadliest patterns were often the ones woven in silence. As the forensics team from Strathbane began their clumsy, heavy-footed dance around the sunroom, Hamish decided it was time to become invisible. Blair was currently shouting into his mobile phone, demanding a full background check on every resident of Lochdubh who had ever purchased a pair of knitting needles, his face a shade of purple that matched the more violent hues of Penelope's mohair collection. Hamish knew that staying at the cottage would only lead to him being assigned the task of guarding a damp perimeter, or worse, being forced to listen to Blair's theories on Gaelic bloodlust. He whistled softly for lugs, and together they slipped away through the dripping rhododendrons, heading back toward the village where the real information was currently being brewed, along with the morning tea. The air in the centre of Lochdubh was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the electric hum of a scandal in full bloom. Hamish didn't head for the station. Instead, he made his way to the post office, a cramped, dusty shop that served as the nervous system of the community. Mrs. Gunn, the postmistress, was a woman who could read the contents of a letter through its envelope and the intent of a villager by the way they licked a stamp. She was already leaning over the counter, her spectacles reflecting the dull light as she peered toward the road, waiting for someone to provide the details she so hungrily craved. "I suppose you've come for a ginger nut and a bit of a sit-down, Hamish Macbeth," she said, her voice sharp with anticipation. "I heard about Penelope Vane. Strangled with her own wool, was she? It seems the ancestors have a bit of a temper this year, especially when it comes to Sassenachs trying to tell us how to spin a yarn we've been making since the Vikings were in nappies." "It's a judgment, Hamish, a pure judgment." Hamish leaned against the counter, looking every bit the indolent constable. "It was a messy business, Mrs. Gunn. Blair thinks it's a peasant revolt, but I'm wondering who had enough of a grudge to turn a knitting retreat into a funeral. Mrs. Vane was a woman who collected enemies like other men collect stamps, wasn't she?" Mrs. Gunn leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried the scent of peppermint and old paper. "She was a bully, Hamish. Did you know she was trying to copyright the Lochdubh diamond pattern, a pattern that's been in the Maclean family for 4 generations? She told poor Elspeth Maclean that if she didn't stop selling her jumpers at the local market, she'd have the lawyers on her for intellectual property theft. And then there were the guests. 3 London women arrived last night. They looked like they'd rather be eating glass than sharing a cottage with Penelope. One of them, a tall, thin creature in a suede coat, was crying on the doorstep before they'd even got the luggage inside. She looked as though she'd been dragged here against her will." Hamish took a slow bite of a biscuit. Mrs. Gunn pushed toward him, his mind cataloguing the list of aggrieved parties. Elspeth Maclean was a gentle soul, but her brothers were known to have tempers that could ignite damp peat. "And the guests, Mrs. Gunn, did they stay the night, or did the mist swallow them up before the trouble started?" "Oh, they stayed," Mrs. Gunn said, her eyes sharpening behind her lenses. "But the taxi driver, Jimmy, said he saw the tall one walking down the Glen Road at midnight, looking as though she was searching for the end of the world. He offered her a lift, but she just stared through him and kept walking toward the old kirkyard. She had no coat, Hamish, just a thin silk dress in the freezing cold. Now you tell me that's the behaviour of a woman here for a relaxing hobby." Hamish nodded slowly, filing the woman in silk under the mental tab of suspects that Blair would inevitably ignore in favour of arresting the man who delivered the manure. He finished his biscuit and wandered back out into the mist, his thoughts turning to the narrow footprints he'd seen by the sunroom door. They hadn't been the heavy work boots of a local or the polished brogues of a detective. They had been light, elegant, and entirely out of place in the Highland muck. As he walked toward the Lochdubh Hotel, hoping to mooch a proper coffee from Nellie in the kitchen, a flash of blonde hair caught his eye. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was standing by her car, looking elegantly distressed as she watched the police vehicles racing toward the Varney cottage. Priscilla represented the old money of the Highlands, the kind of social standing Penelope had tried so desperately to imitate, and Hamish knew that if anyone understood, the deeper undercurrents of the victim's city life, it would be her. Priscilla Halberton Smythe watched Hamish Roach with an expression that sat somewhere between genuine concern and the weary resignation of someone who had seen this Highland drama play out far too many times. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored wool coat that managed to look stylish despite the cloying mist that was currently making Hamish's red hair look like a soaked bird's nest. Lugs, sensing a friendly presence, gave a half-hearted wag of his shaggy tail and sat down on his haunches, his mismatched ears twitching as another distant police siren wailed through the glen, echoing off the damp mountainsides. The village felt claustrophobic, the air thick with the sort of tension that usually preceded a massive storm or a local scandal that would last for generations. "I assume the rumors are true, Hamish," Priscilla said, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to the chaotic energy currently emanating from the Whodunit cottage. "Mrs. Kennedy has already informed the entire village that Penelope Vane has met a rather colourful end. Is that really true about mohair? It sounds like a particularly vindictive piece of performance art, even for Lochdubh." "It is indeed, Priscilla," Hamish replied, leaning against the cold stone wall of the hotel. He looked every bit the indolent constable, his hazel eyes half-lidded, though they were currently scanning the street for any sign of the tall, thin creature Mrs. Gunn had mentioned. A neon-pink message from the past. "Blair is currently up there trying to find a way to arrest every man who owns a sheep or a spinning wheel, but I have a feeling the truth is a bit more sophisticated than a simple peasant revolt." Priscilla sighed, her gaze drifting toward the mountains that loomed over the village. Penelope Vane was not a woman who understood the concept of enough. She spent her life acquiring things, styles, traditions, and people, without any regard for the cost or history she was trampling. My cousin in London knew her well. Penelope didn't just design knitwear. She owned a venture capital firm that specialized in rebranding struggling family businesses, usually by stripping their assets and selling the names to the highest bidder. Why would a woman like that be in such a hurry to bury herself in the Highlands? Hamish mused, his voice dropping into that soft, hypnotic lilt that usually encouraged people to tell him more than they intended. A woman usually moves to Lochdubh to slow down, not to run a knitting retreat for influencers, because she was running from a scandal, Hamish, Priscilla said, lowering her voice as the hotel door creaked open behind them. A massive embezzlement scheme involving an arts foundation she chaired. She was trying to buy respectability here because she had lost it everywhere else. But respectability in Lochdubh isn't something you can buy with a silver Jaguar and a Japanese water feature. As for her guests, they weren't here to knit. They were her former board members. All of them have lost their fortunes because of Penelope's creative accounting. Hamish nodded slowly. The starting fresh card he had heard about earlier began to take on a darker, more desperate hue. If Penelope was a thief on the run, her arrogance wasn't just a personality trait, it was a desperate shield. And the woman in silk, Priscilla? The one Mrs. Gunn says was wandering the Glen Road at midnight in her indoor clothes. Priscilla's expression sharpened, her blue eyes narrowing. That sounds like Sarah Thorne, her former business partner. They've been at each other's throats for years over the foundation's collapse. Sarah's a formidable woman, Hamish, but she's been living in Penelope's shadow for decades. If Penelope died before the new year, Sarah stands to inherit the entirety of the cottage purchase through a loophole in their partnership agreement. She was the tall one crying on the doorstep yesterday. Inheritance, Hamish muttered, looking down at Lugs. A motive as old as the hills, but it still doesn't explain the white heather. Sarah Thorne doesn't strike me as the type to leave Highland tokens in the dead of night, no matter how much she wanted the insurance money. No, Priscilla agreed, but she is exactly the type to use the village's own grievances as a smokescreen. You should talk to Archie MacIver, Hamish. Penelope fired him from the estate yesterday morning after Archie refused to tear down the old dry stone wall on the North Ridge. Archie's a strong man, and he's been very vocal about what he'd like to do to Penelope's minimalist improvements. Hamish felt the familiar, uncomfortable weight of the investigation shifting. Blair would love Archie as a suspect, a local, a labourer, and a man with a documented temper. But the white heather and narrow tracks still haunted Hamish's thoughts. He thanked Priscilla and began the walk toward the harbour, his stomach rumbling for the coffee he still hadn't managed to find. He needed to find Archie before Blair did, because once the chief inspector got his teeth into a local suspect, the truth usually ended up as collateral damage. The harbour at Lochdubh was a study in desolate grey, with the salt spray hanging in the air like a cold, wet shroud that threatened to turn into ice by nightfall. Hamish walked along the pier, the rhythmic slap of the water against the hull of the Heather Bell sounding like a ticking clock in the unnatural stillness of the morning. He found Archie Mac Ivor exactly where he expected, hunched over a pile of tangled, salt-crusted nets, his massive, calloused hands moving with a frantic energy that belied his usual steady, rhythmic pace. Archie was a man built like a Highland bull, all broad show, alders and weathered skin, but today he looked as though the weight of the mountains was resting squarely on his neck, his eyes darting toward the road every time a car engine sounded in the distance. The mist clung to the rigging of the fishing boats, and the smell of diesel and rotting kelp was particularly pungent in the frozen air. "It's a grand day for mending, Archie," Hamish said, leaning against a rusted iron bollard and pulling his cap lower against the biting wind. He reached into his pocket and produced a crumpled pack of cigarettes, offering one with a silent gesture that spoke more of camaraderie than interrogation. Archie didn't look up immediately, but the tension in his forearms was visible as he pulled a knot tight, with a violence that made the nylon cord snap like a pistol shot. "I heard that red-faced devil Blair is up at the manse, Hamish," Archie muttered, his voice gravelly and thick with resentment. "I suppose you've come to tell me I'm next on his list. The whole village knows I told Penelope Vane I'd see her in the ground before I saw that Northridge wall come down. It's been there for 200 years, and that Sassenach wanted it gone for a better view of her plastic garden. She had no respect for the stones, Hamish, none at all. She thought everything could be bought, even the history of the glen." "Blair's certainly looking for a man with a strong back and a grudge," Hamish replied, his voice a soft, deceptive burr that seemed to blend with the wind. "And weaving a web like that takes a man who knows his way around a knot. But I'm more interested in what you saw yesterday morning when you left the cottage. Priscilla tells me you and Penelope had a bit of a final disagreement before she sent you packing." Archie finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and weary. "She's a parasite, Hamish. She told me the wall was an eyesore, a wall my own grandfather built with his bare hands. When I told her where she could shove her artisanal improvements, she told me I was finished and that I'd never work in this county again. But I didn't kill her. I went to the pub, got drunk enough to forget her name, and stumbled home at midnight. I've got half a dozen witnesses who saw me weaving my way past the post office, singing songs that would make the minister blush. I was too drunk to find my own door, let alone tie a woman to a chair with a pink string." Hamish nodded, but his gaze was fixed on Archie's boots, heavy rubber-soled sea boots that were caked in the dark, oily mud of the harbour. They were a far cry from the narrow, elegant prints he had seen by the sunroom door. "Did you see anyone else while you were weaving your way home, Archie? Perhaps a woman in a silk dress or a car that didn't belong to the glen?" Archie paused, his brow furrowing in concentration as he spat into the water. "Aye. A fancy car passed me near Glen Road. A Mercedes, I think. It was driving like the devil was chasing it toward the Strathbane Road. And I saw someone else too, near the old kirkyard. It was that little fellow who works for the tax office, the one who's been staying at the hotel. He was standing by the gate, looking as though he'd lost his favourite penny and found a pound. He looked terrified, Hamish, not like a man on holiday at all." Hamish filed the taxman away for later. He was about to ask another question when the roar of a police siren cut through the salt air, sharp and intrusive. Blair's black sedan screeched to a halt at the end of the pier, followed closely by a van. Blair erupted from the car, his face a triumphant shade of purple, brandishing a clear plastic evidence bag as if it were a trophy. "Macbeth, get out of the way!" Blair bellowed, marching toward them with Anderson trailing behind. "We found it, eh? Anderson, the missing piece that puts this savage behind bars." He shoved the bag toward Hamish's face. Inside was a heavy iron crowbar, stained with the same red paint that had been used on the go-home sign, and something that looked suspiciously like a fragment of Penelope's expensive mohair scarf. Found it in the back of Mac Ivor's shed, tucked under a pile of damp peat. It's got the victim's DNA and MC Ivor's prints all over the handle. It's open and shut, Macbeth. Even a simpleton like you should be able to see that." Chi stood up, his face turning a dangerous shade of white as he looked at the bag. "That's a lie. I haven't used that bar in months. Someone put it there. Hamish, you know me, but—" "Leave it for the station," Blair sneered, gesturing for Anderson to bring the handcuffs. A local dispute over a wall, a bit of vandalism to set the stage, and then a cold-blooded murder using her own hobby as a weapon. "It's poetic justice. I'll have a confession out of him before the sun sets." Mish watched as they led a struggling, cursing Archie toward the car. He looked at the crowbar again. The red paint was still slightly tacky in the crevices, freshly applied despite the freezing cold. Archie was many things, but he wasn't stupid enough to hide a bloody, paint-smeared weapon in his own unlocked shed. It was a red herring so obvious it practically smelled of fish. Someone was feeding Blair exactly what he wanted, and Hamish knew that if he didn't find the taxman or the woman in silk soon, Archie would be spending Christmas in a cell while the real killer enjoyed the quiet. T.E. Harbour fell back into its brooding silence as the taillights of Blair's sedan vanished into the fog, leaving Hamish standing alone with the smell of diesel and salt. The arrest of Archie MacIver was a calculated piece of theatre, one that satisfied Blair's craving for a quick resolution, but left a sour, metallic taste in Hamish's mouth. He knew Archie. The man was capable of a roar that could shake the rafters of the hotel, but he lacked the cold, manipulative streak required to plant a paint-smeared crowbar in his own shed. Hamish whistled for Lugs, who was sniffing suspiciously at the spot where the iron bar had been brandished, and began the long walk back toward the village centre, his mind turning over the taxman Archie had mentioned. If a government auditor was lurking around Lochdubh in the dead of winter, it wasn't tea for the scenery or the quality of the local mutton. He found Mr. Julian Vane, no relation to Penelope, he had clarified thrice, in the residence lounge of the Lochdubh Hotel, a room that smelled of stale sherry and floor wax. The man was a study in beige, a creature who seemed to be composed entirely of damp umbrella and frayed nerves. He was huddled near a sputtering peat fire with a glass of lukewarm milk and a thick, leather-bound ledger that he clutched as if it were a holy relic. Hamish dropped into a chair opposite him with a heavy, deceptive sigh, looking every bit the defeated village constable. "It's a terrible business about Mrs. Vane, isn't it?" Hamish said, pulling his damp cap from his head and rubbing his red hair. "DCI Blair has his man, of course, Archie MacIver, caught him with the murder weapon and everything. The village is in a state of shock, though I suppose the Treasury in Strathbane will be pleased to have the matter settled so quickly. No more paperwork for the auditors, eh?" The little man looked up, his spectacles magnifying eyes that were sharp, restless, and entirely too intelligent for a casual hiker. "Archie MacIver, the fisherman? That seems statistically improbable. A man of his physical profile would hardly have the psychological temperament for such a symbolic execution. To use neon pink mohair? The T requires a sense of irony, Constable. It requires a statement. Penelope Vane was a woman who lived by the thread. It's only poetic that she died by it." Hamish leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper that made the auditor blink. "Irony doesn't usually feature in Blair's reports, Mr. Vane, but you'd know about statements, wouldn't you? Archie says he saw you near the kirkyard last night, looking at the gate, a strange place for a midnight stroll in this weather, for a man on holiday." The auditor stiffened, his thin fingers twitching against the edge of his ledger. "I am an auditor, Macbeth. I don't stroll, I verify. Penelope Vane wasn't just a designer, she was a walking disaster for the Crown. She hadn't just embezzled from a foundation, she had systematically hollowed out her partner's private accounts, leaving Sarah Thorne with nothing but a title and a mounting pile of debt. I wasn't here for the scenery, I was here to ensure her assets were seized before she could flip the cottage to a shell company in Panama. She was planning to flee the country today. And did you find what you were looking for?" Hamish asked, his eyes fixed on the man's boots. They were narrow, expensive leather walking shoes, clean but with a faint crystalline residue around the soles that looked remarkably like the crushed white marble Penelope had used for her sunroom floor. The man snapped his ledger with a sharp crack. "I found that Penelope Vane was a woman who deserved her fate. though I did not administer it. If she died before the new year, the property remains in the partnership's name, and the seizure process becomes a legal quagmire that could take a decade to resolve. Sarah Thorne didn't just have a motive, Constable, she had a deadline. She arrived here yesterday afternoon to confront Penelope about the missing millions. They had a violent row that the whole village likely heard through the vents. Hamish nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift into a new, more dangerous pattern. If Penelope was planning to flee, it explained her frantic behavior. It also explained why someone would go to the immense effort of framing a local. It wasn't just a cover, it was an anchor designed to stop the clock. But a woman like Sarah Thorne couldn't plant a heavy iron bar in a peat shed alone. She would need help, someone who knew the village, someone who had a vested interest in seeing Penelope silenced before she could talk to the authorities in Strathbane. "Money can move mountains, Macbeth," the auditor replied, as if reading his thoughts, his voice thin and cold. "Or evidence. You should look into who Penelope was paying to do her minimalist renovations. She didn't hire locals. She brought in a crew of contractors from Glasgow, men who didn't care about heritage, only about the colour of the money. And one of them stayed behind when the rest left 2 days ago." Hamish stepped back out into the mist, his mind racing. The contractors had supposedly left, but there was a barn near the North Ridge where Penelope kept her imported materials. He had a sudden, vivid image of the narrow, elegant footprints by the sunroom door and the fresh red paint on the crowbar. The trap was being set, but not by him. Someone was using the village's own grievances as a smokescreen, and poor Archie was merely the most convenient casualty. He needed to find the North Ridge, and he needed to do it before the mist turned into a blizzard. The mist began to thin as Hamish climbed back into his ancient Land Rover, but the cold remained, a damp chill that seemed to seep through the floorboards and settle in his very marrow. He knew that if Sarah Thorne or her mysterious accomplice intended to flee, they wouldn't take the main road, Blair H. Ad already set up a half-hearted roadblock near the Strathbane turnoff, mostly to impress the local reporters who had begun to swarm like midges around a ripe fruit. A person of her breeding and desperation would know the old cattle drove paths that skirted the North Ridge, narrow, treacherous tracks that were barely more than gravel and sheep droppings, but which eventually fed onto the A9 far beyond the reach of the official police cordons. Hamish put the vehicle into gear, the engine letting out a protest that sounded like a bag of rusty nails, and headed toward the rear boundary of the Varney estate, his hazel eyes narrowed against the glare of the winter sun. He reached the barn the auditor had mentioned just as the sky turned a pale, bruised violet. The heavy equipment, a yellow mini-excavator and crates of imported marble tiles, sat silent and gleaming with frost inside the open-fronted structure. Hamish hopped out, lugs trotting at his heels with a newfound urgency. The constable knelt by the muddy tracks leading away from the barn, his long fingers tracing the churned earth. There were the deep, ribbed imprints of the excavator's treads, but beside them, almost lost in the muck, were the light, narrow indentations of the same elegant shoes he had seen by the sunroom door. Beside those was a third set of prints, heavy, expensive brogues with a distinctive diamond-patterned sole. The kind worn by a man who preferred to let machines do the heavy lifting. Not just the partner, then. Lugs? Hamish whispered, his breath a plume of white in the frozen air. She had help from someone who knows how to use a machine but wears a suit for a living, someone who wasn't a local but knew exactly where Archie kept his tools. He followed the tracks toward the ridge, his mind turning over the contractors who had supposedly left the village. Penelope had been a woman of extreme paranoia. It was unlikely she would have trusted a crew of strangers with the delicate task of hiding her liquidated assets or securing her flight. She would have used someone closer to home, someone who understood the geography of the glen and had a vested interest in the partnership's survival. Hamish thought of Penelope's personal accountant, a man named Julian Thorne, Sarah's own husband, who had been conspicuously absent from the hotel since the murder was discovered. Julian was the silent partner who had managed the cottage purchase, and he was the only man with the keys to the heavy machinery kept in the north barn. A mile up the ridge, Hamish spotted the flash of silver the postmistress had described. It wasn't a coat, but the taillights of a Mercedes parked precariously on a grassy verge overlooking the steep drop of the glen. As he approached, he saw two figures standing near the open trunk of the car, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. Sarah Thorne was unmistakable in her suede coat, looking absurdly out of place in the wilderness, her face a mask of urban fury. Opposite her stood a man Hamish recognized from the slow-living brochure, Julian Thorne, his sleek, sharp features pinched with a rat-like terror that made him look smaller than he was. They weren't embracing or planning a romantic escape. They were arguing with the frantic, jagged energy of two thieves who had realized the loot was missing. Sarah was brandishing a heavy, leather-bound briefcase, her voice carrying on the wind with a shrill, desperate edge. "You told me it was in the safe, Julian. You said if we stopped her from leaving, the liquid assets would be ours to manage until the partnership was settled. Where is the rest of it?" "She moved it, Sarah," Julian shouted back, his voice cracking with panic. "The mohair, the knitting, it was a distraction, a way to keep the PO. Lice focused on the locals while we cleared the accounts and got the deeds. But she must have seen us coming. She shifted the funds into an offshore trust I can't touch without her biometric signature, which is currently cooling in a morgue." Hamish stepped out from behind a stand of gorse, his hands in his pockets and his cap tilted back in that lazy, deceptive manner that had fooled many a criminal before them. Lugs gave a short, sharp bark that echoed through the valley like a gunshot. The two conspirators froze, their faces turning a matching shade of ashen grey, as they looked at the tall, unkempt figure of the village constable, standing in their path. "It's a bit of a climb for an afternoon chat, isn't it?" Hamish said, his voice a soft, rhythmic burr. "Especially with a briefcase that looks heavy enough to sink a boat. I've just come from seeing Archie Macbeth. He's in a bit of a state, poor man, on account of a crowbar someone left in his shed, a crowbar with red paint that matches the paint on the sign back in the village. It's a pity you didn't realize that in Lochdubh we notice when the colours don't match the character." He wind-whistled through the gorse, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of the Mercedes cooling engine. Julian Thorne did not remove his hand from his coat pocket, and Sarah Thorne remained frozen, her knuckles white as she gripped the leather handle of the briefcase. Hamish stood his ground, appearing for all the world like a man who had merely stopped to discuss the weather, though his hazel eyes were cataloguing every twitch of Julian's jaw. He knew he was playing a dangerous game. He was miles from the nearest telephone, and DCI Blair was currently too busy gloating over Archie Macbeth to realize his perfect case was built on a foundation of theatrical sand and misplaced mohair. "You've got a very vivid imagination, Constable. Julian S. Aid," his voice regaining some of its oily composure, despite the dirt smudged across his cheek. "Marble dust, red paint. These are the delusions of a man who has spent too much time breathing peat smoke and listening to village gossip. We are simply settling Penelope's affairs. My wife is the rightful heir to this partnership. If Penelope met with a tragic accident involving her own eccentric hobbies, it is hardly our concern. That's the trouble with tragic accidents, sir," Hamish replied, his voice a soft, hypnotic lilt that seemed to drift on the freezing air. "They rarely involve a hydraulic lift and a crowbar planted in a fisherman's shed. You see, I had a little chat with the auditor back at the hotel. He's a very thorough man, and is the auditor. He told me that the only way to stop the Treasury from seizing Penelope's assets was for her to die before the new year turned. And he also mentioned that she had enough evidence on the both of you to ensure you'd be trading your silk suits for prison grey." Sarah's eyes flickered with a sudden, sharp panic. She looked at Julian, her composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of the Highland silence. "You said the police were too stupid to look past the fisherman, Julian. You said Macbeth was a non-entity who only cared about his stomach and his stove." "He is a non-entity," Julian hissed, though his eyes remained fixed on Hamish, who was casually patting Lug's shaggy head. "Oh, I am that," Hamish agreed, taking a slow step forward, his boots crunching rhythmically on the frozen gravel. "But even a non-entity can read a trail. The auditor told me there was a second set of keys to the estate's equipment in the partner's office. Your office, Mr. Thorne. It's a pity you didn't realize that red paint stays tacky in the cold. When you used that excavator to move the heavy crates, you must have brushed against he newly painted gate. And then you were kind enough to leave a trail of that same paint right to Archie's woodshed." Julian's face contorted into a mask of cold fury. He pulled his hand from his pocket, but instead of a weapon, he held a small silver remote, the key fob for the Mercedes. "It doesn't matter what you think you know, Macbeth. By the time you get back to that antique Land Rover and crawl to a phone, we'll be halfway to the coast. Blair has his man. He won't want to hear that his brilliant arrest was a mistake. He'll bury you for even suggesting it." "He might," Hamish mused, looking thoughtful as he leaned against a mossy rock. "Blair does hate being wrong. But there's one thing you've forgotten. The briefcase. You were shouting about the missing money when I arrived. You see, Penelope wasn't just running from the taxman. She was running from you. She knew you were skimming from the partnership, Julian. She told Priscilla Halberton Smythe that she was finally about to settle all her debts. She didn't mean she was paying them. She meant she was cutting you out of the biometric trust." Hamish watched the realization sink in. He wasn't just accusing them of murder. He was pointing out that their crime had been for nothing. The briefcase Sarah held was likely filled with nothing but worthless deeds and Penelope's liquidated history. "The money is in an offshore trust," Hamish continued, his voice dropping into a hard, cold register. "And the only person who has the access codes now is the auditor. He's currently waiting for me to call him from the station to confirm that I've found the missing evidence. If I don't call in 20 minutes, he's instructed to hand everything over to the special branch in Glasgow. Not Blair, the real police who don't care about local headlines." This was a blatant lie. The auditor was likely still nursing his milk, but in the isolation of the ridge, it acted like a cold dousing of reality. Julian's arrogance wavered. He looked at the car, then at the steep, mist-shrouded drop of the glen. He was a city man, out of his element in the wild Sutherland terrain, and he was beginning to realize that the lazy Bobby had led him into a trap, where the only exit was a confession. "What do you want, Macbeth?" Julian asked, his voice low and desperate. "I want Archie MacIver out of those handcuffs," Hamish said, his hazel eyes flashing. "And I want the truth about who actually held the needles. Because I have a feeling the accident only happened because Penelope was already dead when the mohair started moving." He whined on the ridge, suddenly dropped, leaving a silence so heavy it felt as though the mountains themselves were leaning in to listen. Julian Thorne's hand trembled slightly on the car door, the silver remote clicking uselessly against the metal. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time the veneer of urban unity between them shattered completely. Sarah wasn't looking at him with the eyes of a partner. She was looking at him with the cold, calculating detachment of a person who had realized the lifeboat was sinking and was prepared to push the only other passenger overboard. The tension between them was as taut as the neon-pink mohair that had bound Penelope Vane to her chair, and Hamish stood back just enough to let the fraying edges of their alliance unravel. "It wasn't the machine that finished her, was it, Julian?" Sarah Thorne said, her voice dropping into a sharp, icy register that made lugs growl. She turned her gaze to Hamish, her face a pale mask of desperation, the suede of her coat fluttering like a surrender flag in the rising evening breeze. "He's right, Constable. The machine was for heavy lifting, staging the scene to protect our investment. Julian spent hours in the DA, sweating like a common labourer, moving those crates and planting that bar to make it look like a local prank had gone tragically wrong. He told me it would look like a freak accident, that Penelope had been attacked by Highland hooligans she'd provoked. But Penelope wasn't an accident, she was a witness." Julian's eyes widened, his face flushing a dark, ugly purple that clashed with his expensive tailoring. "Sarah, be quiet. You're hysterical. You're handing your life to a man who probably can't spell his own name without a dictionary." "I am perfectly lucid," Sarah snapped, stepping away from him toward Hamish, as if seeking the protection of the law she had so recently flouted. Penelope was standing in the sunroom, laughing at us. She'd found the red paint Julian had hidden in the barn, the same paint he'd used to frame that fisherman. She knew what we were trying to do. She stood there in her silk robe, telling us that she'd already emptied the accounts and that we'd be lucky to inherit the lint in her pockets. She called Julian a third-rate clerk and me a faded shadow. She was going to call the police right then and there. She had her hand on the phone, Hamish. She was smiling while she ruined us. Hamish remained perfectly still, his hazel eyes fixed on Julian. The accountant looked small now, his expensive suit rumpled and his sharp features pinched with a rat-like terror. "And that was the personal touch, wasn't it, Mr. Thorne?" Hamish asked softly, his voice barely a whisper against the Highland breeze. The machine was too slow for a man with his hand on the telephone. You couldn't wait for the accident to happen while she was calling Strathbane. She was going to ruin 10 years of my life, Julian burst out, the words tumbling out in a frantic, jagged rush that signalled the total collapse of his composure. 10 years I spent cleaning up her mess. So I managed her shell companies, I hid her embezzlements from the board, I lied to the auditors until I was grey with it, and she was going to walk away with every penny, leaving me to face the music while she sunned herself in Panama. I didn't even think. I just grabbed the knitting needles from the table, the ones she was so proud of, and I struck before the laughing stopped. And then I used the wool, the ridiculous pink mohair, to make it look like some savage local ritual. It was justice, Macbeth. A woman like that didn't deserve a clean death. The confession hung in the freezing air, raw and ugly. Sarah Thorne let out a jagged sob, dropping the heavy briefcase onto the gravel. It burst open, revealing not gold bars or silk-bound ledgers, but a chaotic mountain of unpaid invoices, legal threats, and Penelope Vane's personal diary, the liquidated history of a woman who had been dead inside, long before she ever reached the glen. Julian suddenly lunged, but not toward Hamish. He made a desperate, scrambling dash for the Mercedes, his fingers clawing at the door handle. But he had forgotten the Highland terrain and the deceptive slickness of the frost-covered heather. His diamond-patterned brogues, so stylish in a London office, found no purchase on the steep, muddy verge. He slipped, his legs tangling in a thicket of gorse, and he began to slide toward the jagged edge of the ridge. "Lugs, hold!" Hamish commanded. The dog didn't need to be told twice. He was a blur of shaggy fur, pinning Julian's sleeve to the earth with a set of teeth that meant business. Hamish moved with a surprising fluid speed, his long limbs covering the distance in seconds. He grabbed Julian by the collar of his expensive coat and hauled him back onto the level ground with a strength that made the accountant gasp for air. "You're not going over the edge today, Mr. Thorne," Hamish said, his voice hard and cold. "You've got a date with DCI Blair, and I think he's going to be very interested in hearing how you tried to make a fool of him with that crowbar. He doesn't like being made a fool of, does the inspector?" Hamish pulled a pair of rusted, salt-crusted handcuffs from his greatcoat pocket, the ones he usually used to secure his bike to the station railing, and snapped them onto Julian's wrists. He looked over at Sarah, who was slumped against the car. "Pick up your papers, ma'am. We've a long walk back to the village, and I'm still waiting for that cup of coffee." The descent from the ridge was a slow, punishing crawl through the deepening shadows of the glen, the freezing air biting at their faces as the sun finally vanished behind the jagged peaks. Hamish led the way, his hand firmly on Julian Thorne's elbow, while Sarah Thorne followed like a ghost in her tattered suede coat, her elegant shoes sinking into the peaty soil with every resentful step. By the time the lights of Lochdubh appeared in the distance, twinkling like cold diamonds against the dark velvet of the mountains, Hamish had already begun the delicate process of mental architecture. He knew that bringing Julian and Sarah directly to the station as his captives would be a tactical disaster. Blair would be humiliated by the reversal, and a humiliated Blair was a vindictive Blair, likely to respond by recommending Hamish for a promotion and an immediate transfer to the concrete purgatory of Glasgow just to get him out of his hair. "Now listen closely, Mr. Thorne," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, almost sympathetic burr as they neared the outskirts of the village. "And you too, ma'am. DCI Blair is a man of great sensitivity and a very short temper. He's already told the press he's caught the killer in Archie McIver. If you go in there shouting that a simple village beau BB outsmarted you, he'll be in such a foul mood that he'll likely throw the book at you both, conspiracy, murder, and resisting arrest. But if you play it another way, well, it might go easier at the fiscal's office." Julian looked at him, his face smeared with dirt and his eyes wide with a desperate animal hope. "What way, Macbeth? You've already got us in irons." "The way of the voluntary disclosure," Hamish whispered, stopping them just outside the pool of light from the station windows. "We'll tell him that you were actually coming to find him, that you'd realized the weight of your conscience and were trying to secure the evidence before the local mob could destroy it. I just happened to find you on the road, and offered to escort you in. Let Blair discover the truth of your involvement through his own brilliant questioning. If he thinks he's the one who broke you, he'll be so pleased with himself he might just forget to mention the more embarrassing details of the excavator and the white heather. As they reached the station, the scene inside was one of controlled chaos. Blair was on the telephone, his voice booming through the open window about Highland savagery and the triumph of modern policing over peasant grudges. Archie MacIver sat in the corner of the room, still in handcuffs, looking like a caged, weary lion. Hamish ushered his two guests inside, adopting an expression of profound, vacant confusion that made him look like he had trouble counting his own fingers. "But, sir, thank goodness you're here," Hamish cried, sounding like a man who had just barely survived a difficult encounter with a particularly stubborn sheep. "I found these two wandering the North Ridge Road, sir. They said they were looking for you. Something about the estate papers and Mrs. Vane's secret accounts. I thought it best to bring them straight to the mastermind before T.K. got lost in the mist." Blair slammed the receiver down, his eyes bulging as he took in the bedraggled accountant and the pale, shaking Sarah Thorne. "Looking for me? Of course they were. They knew their little scheme was falling apart under the pressure of my investigation." He marched over to Julian, his face inches from the man's nose, his breath smelling of stale coffee and triumph. "You thought you could hide behind the fisherman, didn't you, Thorne? But I saw through your little crowbar trick from the start. I let Macbeth escort you just to see if you'd lead him to the loot." Hamish retreated to the corner, busying himself with the kettle and looking as though he might trip over his own feet. "It was brilliant, sir, the way you let me wander off as a decoy while you focused on the real forensic trail. I never would have suspected the accountant had such a heavy hand with the mohair." "Of course you wouldn't, Macbeth. You were the distraction," Blair roared, his chest expanding by several inches. He turned to Anderson, who was watching Hamish with a look of dawning realization. "Get MacIver out of those cuffs. He's just a simpleton who was caught in the crossfire. The real criminals are here. Anderson, get the tape recorder. I'm about to break the biggest embezzlement and murder conspiracy this county has seen in a decade." Blair began to bark questions at Julian, who, sensing the lifeline Hamish had thrown him, began to break with perfect theatrical timing. Hamish slipped a cup of tea to a bewildered Archie MacIver. "Oh, home, Archie," Hamish whispered, unlocking the man's final constraint. "And tell your sister to put the kettle on. The revolution is over and Blair has his trophy." Watched as Blair, now in his element and surrounded by the glow of his own perceived genius, began to weave a narrative that completely erased Hamish from the climax of Case. It was a masterpiece of ego-driven fiction, and Hamish couldn't have been happier. He had saved his neighbour, caught a killer, and most importantly, ensured that his name would be nothing more than a footnote in a report that would soon be gathering dust in a Strathbane filing cabinet. The following morning, the Highland sun made a rare, brilliant appearance, reflecting off the fresh dusting of snow on the peaks of the Cuillin like a million scattered diamonds. The village of Lochdubh appeared reborn, the air crisp and cleansed of the frantic artificial energy that Penelope Vane had brought with her from the city. Hamish Macbeth stood at the door of the police station, a chipped mug of coffee warming his hands and lugs sitting contentedly at his feet, sniffing at the sharp, clean air. The heavy black sedans and forensic vans had departed in the early hours, their tyres leaving deep, definitive tracks in the slush as they headed back to the civilization of Strathbane. DCI Blair had been the last to leave, his face glowing with a self-importance so profound it threatened to ignite his very collar. He hadn't even looked at Hamish as he climbed into his car, merely barking a final order for the constable to scrub the floors and try not to lose the station keys before the new year. To Blair, Hamish was once again the useless, red-haired peasant who had served as a convenient, if dim-witted, footman to his own brilliant detective work. "He's a happy man, Lugs," Hamish murmured, taking a slow, appreciative sip of the bitter coffee. "And a happy Blair is a distant Blair. We've managed to save our skin for another season, and the station remains ours." He watched as the village began to return to its natural, unhurried pace. Mrs. Gunn was already out on the pavement, vigorously sweeping the front of the post office and pausing only to exchange a knowing nod with the locals who passed by. The go-home paint on the gates of the Vane cottage was already being scrubbed away by a team of workers who looked far more relaxed now that their employer was no longer shouting about artisanal efficiency and brand standards. The neon pink mohair, which had briefly become the most famous substance in Sutherland, had been hauled away in evidence bags, leaving the glen to return to its traditional palette of heather green and granite grey. Hamish set his mug down on the windowsill and began the short, rhythmic walk toward the harbour, his long legs moving with an easy stride that suggested he hadn't a care in the world. He found Archie MacIver at the pier, looking more like his old self, though there was a lingering shadow in his eyes that only time and the salt air would truly wash away. Archie was hauling a crate of fresh langoustines onto the dock, his massive shoulders moving with the steady, unburdened pace of a man who knew he was home to stay. He stopped when he saw Hamish, his weathered face softening into an expression of gruff, unspoken gratitude that was worth more to the constable than any official commendation from headquarters. "I hear the accountant is singing like a canary in the Strathbane holding cells," Archie said, pausing to wipe his brow with a salt-stained sleeve. "And the lady partner is currently explaining to the fiscal why she was helping him load a car with stolen deeds in the middle of the night. The village is saying Blair is a genius for catching them before they reach the coast road. They're calling it the Neon Knot case in the papers. Blair is exactly what he wants to be, Archie," Hamish replied, leaning against a rusted iron bollard and looking out over the calm, dark waters of the loch. "And the best part is that he won't be back in Lochdubh for long. He's too busy being a hero in the city news and tack." Ing the credit for profiling the accountant's psychological breakdown. He's even convinced himself that he was the one who spotted the marble dust on Thorne's shoes during his first walkthrough of the sunroom. Archie looked at Hamish, a small, rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You're deep, Macbeth. Most men would want the medal for clearing a neighbour's name and catching a murderer on a frozen ridge. Most men would want the world to know they weren't the fool the inspector says they are. Medals are heavy things, Archie. They pin you down to a desk and a title, and they invite people from Edinburgh to come and ask you questions about your paperwork," Hamish said, his voice a soft, contented burr. "Recognition is just another word for more work and less coffee, and I've had quite enough of both this week." He left the harbour and made his way back toward the hotel, his mind already turning toward the small domestic details of his life. He needed to check his lobster pots, and there was a certain salmon in the andeur that had been mocking him for a fortnight. The artisanal knitting mystery had been unravelled. The outsider's greed had met the cold reality of the Highlands, and the peace of Lochdubh was restored. As Hamish stepped into the hotel kitchen to see if Nellie had any scones, he felt the satisfying weight of his own invisibility. He was still the lazy, red-haired constable of a forgotten bog, and in the grand, complicated world of the Highlands there was no place he would rather be. The shadows of the late afternoon grew long and blue across the village square, casting a tranquil veil over Lochdubh that made the violence and neon-pink chaos of the previous days feel like a half-remembered bad dream. Inside the police station, the peat stove was humming with a steady, rhythmic warmth, and the air was thick with the comforting, slightly burnt aroma of Hamish's latest pot of coffee. He sat in his battered armchair, his boots off and his feet stretched toward the heat, while lugs lay across the hearthrug, twitching his ears in a dream of chasing mountain hares through the frozen heather. The official report was finished, a masterpiece of strategic omission that credited DCI Blair's unrivaled instinct for every major breakthrough in the case. Hamish knew that somewhere in Strathbane Blair was likely holding court in a pub, regaling his subordinates with a tale of how he had seen through the accountant's ruse within seconds of arriving at the scene. To Blair, the neon-pink mohair was a trophy of his own genius. To Hamish, it was a reminder that the most tangled webs were usually spun by those who thought they were too clever for the Highlands. The door creaked open, and Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped in, looking as cool and elegant as a winter morning in a charcoal-grey cashmere coat. She didn't wait for an invitation, moving toward the stove with the easy familiarity of a woman who knew exactly how much space she occupied in Hamish's complicated life. "I see the hero of the hour is back to his usual state of professional collapse," she said, her voice carrying that melodic, teasing edge that always made Hamish sit up a little straighter. "I just saw the afternoon edition of the Gazette. Blair cracks the knitting killer. It's quite a read, Hamish. It mentions you only once, as the officer responsible for securing the perimeter, while the masterminds were apprehended. "It's a fine role, Priscilla," Hamish replied, a slow, lazy grin spreading across his face as he reached for a chipped mug. "Securing perimeters doesn't require me to fill out any commendation forms, and it doesn't invite the superintendent to come sniffing around for a promotion. If Blair wants to be the sun, I'm perfectly happy to be the shadow." Priscilla sat on the edge of the desk, her blue eyes fixed on him with a sharp, knowing intensity. "You played him perfectly, as usual. But tell me one thing, Hamish, the white heather by the body. Julian Thorne said he moved the body and used the crowbar to frame Archie, but he seemed genuinely confused when Blair shouted at him about the heather. He swore that in his life he would never touch it." Hamish took a slow sip of his coffee, the steam fogging his hazel eyes for a moment. Aye, he was confused, because he didn't put it there, Priscilla. Neither did Sarah Thorne. They were too busy thinking about offshore accounts and biometric signatures to think about Highland luck. Then who did? "I suspect it was young Geordie from the farm," Hamish said softly, his voice a gentle burr. "The lad who delivered the manure." He felt bad about the mess, even if Penelope deserved a bit of a dampening. He went back to the cottage later that night to clear a bit of the road, trying to make amends before the guests arrived. He saw the body through the sunroom window long before Mrs. Kennedy did. He was terrified the village would be blamed, so he left the heather as a bit of a prayer for her soul, and a bit of luck for the rest of us. He didn't tell a soul, but I saw a fresh sprig of it tucked into his cap when I saw him at the pub this evening. Priscilla shook her head, a soft smile playing on her lips. So the one piece of evidence that made Blair think it was a savage local ritual was actually a gesture of kindness from the very boy he wanted to arrest. There's a certain justice in that, isn't there? The Highlands are a complicated place, Priscilla. People see what they want to see. Blair saw a conspiracy. I saw a boy who didn't want the Glen to have a bad name. As Priscilla rose to leave, the silence of the station felt deeper, more permanent. The Sassenach influence had been purged, the greedy had been gathered up by the law, and the village of Lochdubh had once again folded its secrets back into the mist. Hamish watched her go, then reached for his greatcoat. There was a cold wind rising, and the salmon in the Andub were waiting. He had no medals, no promotions, and no mentions in the headlines, but as he stepped out into the crisp, salt-scented night with lugs at his side, he knew he had something far better. He had his home, and he had his peace.